And so, Carl, here's the million-dollar question. Do you believe that a higher form of non-human intelligence has visited this planet?
Right. So non-human intelligence exists. Non-human intelligence has been interacting with humanity. This interaction is not new, and it's been ongoing. And there are unelected people in the government that are aware of that.
And so, Carl, that is quite a bold statement. I'm wondering, and I'm curious, how confident are you that that is true?
There's zero doubt.
So that intro was pretty far out, wasn't it? That was retired Colonel Carl Nell speaking at the SALT conference, which is Global Investment Platforms Connecting Institutions, Asset Owners, and Technology Entrepreneurs. So that's in June 2024. That wasn't at a UFO conference or a Paleocontact conference. That was Global Investment Platform people. This video is about something that I've been fascinated with for a long time, which is obviously Paleocontact, but it's been a bit of a hobby of mine to try and find high-level people admitting on record that this UFO, UAP, tic-tac, go fast, EBE phenomena goes back a lot longer than World War II. I've collected some pretty good ones for you. The first gentleman, retired Colonel Carl Nell, who was a US Army colonel, a very highly creditable person, Ivy League scholar, worked for many of the biggest name corporations. In the end, he was on the UAP task force, which you would have heard of, investigating what was being seen by the US Navy over a number of years, what fighter pilots and other people kept running into, literally, these incredible craft breaking all the rules of aviation. And he says in that clip that not only do non-human intelligences exist, but they've been interacting with humanity. It's not new and it's ongoing. So when he says it's not new, perhaps he's saying it's been around since 1947. Perhaps these interactions have been happening since then. But my feeling is what he's saying is it's not new. It's been going on for a long, long time. And other voices in this video will tell you that exact idea and tell you that they've been here for thousands of years, if not millions. And I like the way Carl Nell at the end is asked, how confident are you that this is the truth? And he looks at the audience and says, there is zero doubt. I like him. I like him a lot. So let's get on to it, and I'll comment a little bit as we go through.
You know, talk about the free press, that's the biggest joke in the world. We don't have a free press. If we had a free press, we would have sightings, huge reports in the papers of all sorts of things, including the Armada that flew south over Europe in, I guess it was 1963, of about 50 UFOs. And the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in Europe was concerned and about to press the panic button. Unfortunately, they all turned around and went back over the North Pole. So he was satisfied they weren't Soviets and that they were in fact had to be extraterrestrial. So he ordered a study to be done, and it took 3 years. And what the study concluded was that there had been at least 4 species, at least 4, visiting Earth for thousands of years. This is not a new phenomenon. This goes a way, way back and predates what we call our modern history of the last 10 or 15,000 years. And so, did that receive widespread press? No. No.
Don't you just love somebody like this? The Right Honourable Paul Hellyer is now sadly passed away in 2021 at the age of 98, a grand age. But he's telling us not only are we constantly lied to by the media, he essentially says in the rest of his interview that it's quite a corrupt system, but he states that this assessment came to the conclusion that we'd been visited by several races. They've been interacting with us, as Carl Nell said, for a long time, and he specifically says thousands of years, and he says before 10, 11,000 years ago, which is the time of the Younger Dryas, and there's been a lot of very interesting research and discovery happening there, including Paul Wallace and Matt Lacroix recently went to Anatolia and looked at the amazing ruins, sort of mountain fortresses in Anatolia, and also the undersea ancient buildings that seem to be well over 10,000 years old. And that's an ongoing research they're doing. They're going back again. And Paul and I have been discussing this and talking about the connection with the Vikings and the Viking Age and the ancient stories. And Paul very kindly mentioned me and some of the things that I had discussed with him, some of the information I'd given him in his latest book, Invasions of Eden. So make sure you check that out. So yes, the plot thickens. So let's go on to a gentleman who was there when the assessment was made, when this study was secretly brought out, and he actually saw it when he's working for NATO, and he has some fascinating things to say about that.
The Defense Intelligence Agency and every one of the, I think maybe at least 24 major security organizations in our government concluded that beyond the shadow of a doubt, this secret must be kept not only from the American people, but from the world population at large. And as a result of that decision, they have created a worldwide conspiracy among governments to keep the lid on this secret. Now, let me share with you what some of the 4 major conclusions of the assessment were in 1964, and consider those bits of information with what you've already learned in your own research and studies, and what's been brought out in films and UFO conferences over the last 10, 15 years. In 1964, they had determined, at least this is in the NATO study, and I know for a fact that this is the conclusions that had been reached by our own military as early as 1949. Number 1, the planet Earth is and has been the subject of an extensive, massive, a very thorough and detailed study by several extraterrestrial civilizations. Now that's an attention getter in itself. Number 2, these civilizations have demonstrated an extremely advanced technology, possibly hundreds or even thousands of years beyond our own. It gets better. There seems to be a process or a plan of some kind unfolding. The studies indicated and demonstrated that a development of some kind of program was underway. Evidence collected indicated that the program has been going on for a very long time, possibly hundreds or even thousands of years, and some of my associates, research fellows, and I have concluded it's probably been going on longer than that. The study concluded that there did not appear to be a major military threat involved in 1964. That if they, whoever they are, were malevolent or hostile, there was absolutely nothing we could do, because the level of technology that had been demonstrated was so far beyond anything we had in 1964 that we felt that if they were hostile or malevolent, the game was up. It was all over with.
I like the fact that his assessment is that these beings are not hostile, or at least if they wanted to take over and make us into food, make us into their total slaves, it would have happened a long time ago. We are extremely well outclassed. There's all sorts of things you could believe, but I tend to side with Dr. Richard Greer, who's been a great influence on me with his Serious Disclosure channel, which I take my hat off to him, even though I haven't got a hat, because his series of early videos, especially from the 90s, talking to people like this, high-level people, credible people, people who I couldn't see would be lying for any reason, convinced me that the UFO phenomenon was a real thing. Shocked me with the amount of amazing stories that are completely ignored, that, you know, when you get these skeptics like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who just completely writes it all off unless they land in his backyard. I mean, there's just hundreds of stories from such credible people. You'd think, how can anyone listen to this and say, well, there's no evidence? I need to see the craft. I need to have a piece of it sitting here. To me, it shows incredible distrust. So much of our life is based on trusting other people. You just cannot think everyone is a rotten liar all the time. If you can't tell when people are sincere, I don't think you've learnt much in this life. Anyway, let's carry on with Robert Dean's amazing testimony.
Well, Don, it began for me in 1963 when I was assigned to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Europe. I arrived in the summer of '63 and I was assigned to the Operations Division. I was further assigned to what we call SHOC, the War Room, the Supreme Headquarters Operations Center. And at that time I was given a cosmic top secret clearance, which was and still is the highest level of security access that NATO has. When I was assigned to the War Room, I learned that a study had been initiated in 1961, and everybody was talking about it. They were gossiping about it. And the subject was UFOs, and that intrigued me a bit. When that study was concluded in 1964 and it was published, and I was still working in the War Room at that time, I had access to this document. I had a chance to read it. And having been exposed to it, I must tell you honestly that my life has never ever quite been the same. Because I read first-hand reports, verifiable NATO military material that indicated that the UFOs were not only real, but they represented something far beyond anything I had ever imagined before. When the study was concluded in '64, they concluded that there were 4 different groups apparently coming and visiting us. Out of those 4 different groups, one group looked exactly like we do, so much so that they could sit beside you in a restaurant or in an airplane or in a theater, and you'd never know. And that particular point bothered the military guys a lot. The point being that some of these people from somewhere could be walking up and down the corridors of SHAPE headquarters, or they could be walking up and down the corridors of the Pentagon. One day at lunch, a lieutenant colonel made the remark, he says, Jesus, do you realize they could even be in the White House? And there was a little forced laughter at that point, I remember, because a lot of us over the years have had some misgivings about the occupants of the White House. But the point I'm making is that the idea that aliens could be here in our midst bothered the military, because if you're not paranoid when you go into the service, you're certainly trained very quickly to be so. It's the nature of the military mind, I think, to be paranoid. But that was only part of the story. The SHAPE conclusions in '64 were that there were 4 groups that we knew of. They were apparently interplanetary. Some very likely were interstellar. They even concluded that some of them could be intergalactic. When I retired in 1976, many of our military people knew at that point that we were not simply dealing with visitations from people from other planets or star systems. They had concluded by 76 that some of these visitors very well might be multidimensional in their source. The evidence that we had collected and the evidence that they had repeatedly demonstrated to us, and that's no accident. It became very clear after a time that there was a program or a process of some kind underway, that they had demonstrated over and over and over again that they apparently were able to manipulate matter and time. Now this really shook up our scientists. There are a lot of new young scientists in particle physics today who talk about multiple dimensions. There's a brilliant young professor in New York by the name of Michio Kaku, who has written a brilliant book called Hyperspace, where they talk about 10 separate dimensions.
So wasn't that an amazing bit of testimony? And for me, the exciting thing is this idea that they're amongst us, that they look exactly like us. They could be sitting beside you. They could be in the halls of power. This fits exactly into the Old Norse paradigm because those gods, they intermarry with humans. The AESIR, they essentially are just really beautiful, really amazing humans with extraordinary levels of paranormal power, and they take over without, doesn't really say that they use their force to take over up in the north. I suppose there could be that aspect to it. There is indications about battles being fought without really information about what they were about, but I think essentially it was a good thing. People seem to really think they were just so wonderful, and they were happy to be under their care and to try and emulate the sort of people they were. We'll now go on to listen to that brilliant young physicist, Michio Kaku, who Robert Dean speaks about there.
What an incredible experience to meet such an incredibly brilliant man as Michio Kaku. He's a professor at New York University, but one of the fathers of the theoretical physics concept called string theory. Mind-blowing stuff. He acknowledges the reality of the phenomenon in a way that very few scientists are prepared to do publicly. Professor Kaku, the debunkers, the skeptics, they say there is no evidence of anomalous phenomena, that really the gimbal, the go fast, the tic-tac videos, they don't prove anything. What do you say to that?
I'm a physicist. We live and die with the data. We go where the data goes, even if we have to be dragged kicking and screaming into areas that we feel uncomfortable with. We go where the data goes. And the gold standard for the data is multiple sightings by multiple modes. Now think about that. Throughout history, people would say, look, Martha, look, I see something up there. Well, maybe you did, or maybe you didn't. That is not reproducible, and it's only you, and perhaps you were drunk that day, or perhaps you really did encounter something. It's not conclusive. What we need is multiple sightings by multiple modes, meaning more than one person has seen something up there, independently verified it, with multiple modes. That is radar, infrared sensors, optical sensors, multiple ways in which we can then triangulate and then give you the data of what was up there.
And that's why those US Navy sightings from firstly 2004 and more recently right through to the present day are so important, because they're getting multiple data on different platforms.
The recent pressure by Congress on the military has forced the military to own up to the fact that it's sitting on hours of videotapes of something that is up there in the sky, and that many of the military men who've seen these things were told not to make waves. Don't make waves if you want to make sure that your career is on the right track. And so now the floodgates are being opened. In other words, the burden of proof is now shifting. It used to be that the burden of proof was on the individual to prove that there was something up there and that he wasn't drunk. Now the burden of proof is on the military to prove that these objects aren't extraterrestrial.
Why do you say that, though? Why do you say that the burden of proof is reversed? I mean, your detractors have suggested you're going a bit far there. Why do you say that?
We go where the data goes, and the data goes in the direction of something. We follow the data, and the data indicates that something is out there that can be tracked by radar, infrared sensors, tracked optically, that can travel between Mach 5 times the speed of sound, up to Mach 20. Now, think about that for a moment. Up to Mach 20, this is far beyond commercial aircraft, and yet here we have sightings that can be triangulated and analyzed using these videotapes. We have gone frame by frame over the trajectories of these objects, and we now realize that they can exceed the capabilities of our aircraft. They can drop 70, 80,000 feet within just a matter of a few seconds. They can zigzag, and we physicists now have calculated the g-forces inside these, whatever they are. The g-forces are in the hundreds of times of the force of gravity.
That'd turn any human into pea soup.
In other words, it would crush the bones of any object, any organism that we're familiar with. And so these objects are probably drones of some sort, because they can exceed the capabilities of our aircraft and put pressures on the pilots that would crush their bones.
Now, the two intelligence experts from the US Defense Department who gave evidence on the 17th of May to Congress, Ron Moultrie, Scott Bray, two of the top officials in the Pentagon's intelligence section, they suggested very strongly that these were drones, these anomalous objects. To your knowledge, though, is there any known terrestrial human technology that is capable of what these objects have been seen doing?
Well, if these objects can do what the data seems to indicate, then they exceed the capabilities of even our drones. We have hypersonic drones that can go up to Mach 20, but they're unstable. The United States had a very vigorous hypersonic drone program up to 2 years ago, but abandoned it. Because when these things begin to maneuver, they spiral out of control and then crash. That's why the Russians are pushing this technology, because they want to evade a Star Wars program by having maneuverable rockets. But you see, that's the problem. Once they start to maneuver, then small oscillations build up until they spiral out of control and then crash. So far, no one's been able to create a hypersonic drone that can duplicate the feats that we see on videotape.
Do you see any evidence to justify a conclusion that these might be foreign adversaries?
Well, when you look at the Pentagon's statement on these objects, it lists the various possibilities, weather anomalies and so on and so forth. And at the end, the last option is other. Now, what does that mean, other? Well, we realize that the Chinese have a hypersonic drone program. The Russians have an operational hypersonic drone program that they're using in the Ukraine. The United States is now reinvigorating and refinancing its hypersonic drone program. But these are all experimental, and the track record of these hypersonic drones is not very good. And you realize that these sightings go back decades before anyone even conceived of hypersonic drones.
So what are they?
So we're left with the last option, and that is other. And other includes, well, maybe a renegade country. Just like if you watch James Bond movies, there's always some Smersh or Spectre out there that has a secret program with access to advanced technology, maybe a James Bond type secret organization. And for the first time, the military is not immediately excluding the possibility of there being extraterrestrial. This is new. In other words, one military official was quoted as saying, quote, "They are not ours." And if they're not ours, then whose are they?
So do you think it's quite plausible that there is an alien civilization that's been taking an interest in planet Earth for quite some time.
There are some people who claim that perhaps these visitations go back thousands of years, not just back to World War II. If you look at the Bible, for example, there are sightings in the Bible. Ezekiel talks about the wheel in the sky, for example, in the chapter on Ezekiel. So then the question is, were we visited in the past? Well, I'm a physicist. We believe in data that is testable, reproducible, falsifiable. And it's not testable, it's not reproducible whether or not we were visited in biblical times. But it cannot be dismissed.
I really love Michio Kaku. I think he's just the most incredible person, such a extremely high level, highly regarded physicist, very famous. Yet he just openly says, well, we've got to give this a chance. We've got to think about this. We've got to look into it. We can't close our minds off. That's not true science. And I like the way he accepts the possibility that perhaps we have been visited in the ancient past. And he talks about what Eric von Daniken, Paul Anthony Wallace, Mauro Biglino and others talk about, things in the Bible like the famous encounter of Ezekiel, the prophet, who saw this craft coming and he heard the sound of great waters, like a waterfall, which is really a great description of the sound of rockets or, air-breathing jets. The things he saw, he tried to explain, even to the point that there was a canopy, actually a sort of a crystalline canopy. Who would think about that? But he tried to describe something like that. And the suit that the being was wearing, and there was other beings, and incredibly, the words that are used in most Bible translations in English talk about the glory of God lifted up. But the real words, as Paul shows, is actually the heavy thing, the ruach. And there's a couple of other words. The big heavy thing lifts up. And Ezekiel talks about being sort of pressed down and oppressed. And it really sounds like G-forces. And it makes him quite angry because he just doesn't understand what's happening. He feels like he's been unfairly pushed on. And then he looks out and goes, whoa, and sees the world disappearing underneath him. And it's the sort of stuff that would take an incredible imagination for a person who grows up in a totally non-technological, low-tech civilization to come up with these ideas. So Michio Kaku is somebody worth listening to, and if he's got an open mind, I've got an open mind. This next video is one that really floored me when it came out. There was a book written in Hebrew by Israeli retired general and highly regarded professor Haim Eshed, and he wrote a book about his experiences in charge of Israeli space defense. He launched a number of satellites for Israel. He was a guy who knew what he's talking about in this field, and he states what he states, and I'll let this tell you about it.
After 30 years at the helm of the Israeli space security program, and after receiving 3 Israeli security awards, retired Israeli general and respected professor Haim Eshed is now unveiling that yes, there are aliens among us, yes, Israel has made contact with them, and no, humanity is not ready for them. Also, before you start doubting his words, the 87-year-old Eshed was clear in his recent interview with Yediot Ahronot News that he's not talking about immigration, but rather about a galactic federation complete with an underground base on Mars, where there are American and alien representatives apparently present. He also explains that President Trump both knows about them and was on the verge of disclosing their existence, only to be persuaded not to by the Federation.
And finally, a word from an eccentric millionaire actor, sort of a groovy rock star hippie sort of guy, Russell Brand, who we all knew and loved for many years in his zany films, Take Me to the Greek and all sorts of things. And I just always really enjoyed his, I think it's a Cockney accent, but it's maybe not. But he's a very English sort of comedian, a very punk era, hip sort of guy. And of course, he's now become a much more political commentator. I think Russell's a very sharp chap. He's not the drug-addled guy he often portrays. And he's really putting his heart and soul and mind into what he's talking about. As I said, whether you agree with him or not. He's trying to talk about a better world for us, and his major concern is the power of the military-industrial complex and the media complex that Eisenhower warned about, probably something to do with the UFO phenomenon too. Anyway, here's Russell. This took me by surprise when I saw this on an interview, and I think it's a good way to leave off this selection of high-profile people basically affirming Paleocontact and the Ancient Astronaut theory. Okay.
How like the governments of our time to take the ontological miracle that there are advanced intergalactic species communicating with us, some of you believe that, some of you don't, and turn it into additional expenditure for military private contractors. This is a sort of miracle akin to the kind of revelations that you would read in scripture. There are pervasive intercosmic consciousnesses communicating with us. Potentially this has been happening throughout civilization. Maybe the reason there are gaps in our observable evolution is because for a long time we've been communing with advanced species that perhaps have even been involved in our advancing civilization. Perhaps some of the phenomena we discuss in scripture, religion, in temples and synagogues around the world relates to these heavenly beings, these orbs in the sky, these chariots of fire.